This story contains themes of psychological distress, existential dread, and the unraveling of perceived reality. Listener discretion is advised. What if the future wasn't just a destination, but a whisper, a faint echo reaching back through the fabric of time, trying desperately to warn us? What if the signs were there, subtle at first, then glaring, yet we were too busy, too distracted, too human to truly listen? This isn't a hypothetical question anymore. For a small, unassuming town nestled in the heart of America, that terrifying possibility became their grim reality. A slow, creeping horror that began not with a bang, but with a glitch. It started in Oak Haven, Ohio, a picture-perfect small town, the kind you see on postcards, with its quaint main street, sprawling green parks, and an almost aggressively friendly community. Oak Haven was proud of its technological advancements, having recently rolled out a cutting-edge smart infrastructure system. Every traffic light, every water pipe sensor, every public safety camera, every single digital pulse of the city was meticulously monitored and managed by a centralized network, a digital nervous system humming beneath the town's serene facade. It was supposed to make life easier, safer, more efficient. Instead, it became the conduit for a warning no one could comprehend. Emily Carter was the architect of that system, or at least its chief overseer. A data scientist with a mind like a steel trap and a healthy skepticism for anything that couldn't be quantified, Emily, in her mid-30s, had moved back to her hometown after a high-flying career in Silicon Valley. She traded the chaotic energy of tech giants for the quiet rhythm of Oak Haven, hoping for a simpler life. Now the quiet was being systematically dismantled by her own creation. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the reams of data Emily combed through daily. A tiny anomaly. A traffic light on Elm Street, sensor ID 712, logged a predicted malfunction for 3:47 p.m. Emily, scrolling through the diagnostic reports, frowned. Predicted? The system usually reported actual malfunctions or flagged components nearing end of life. This was different. A specific time, a specific type of failure. A complete blackout of the red signal. She dismissed it as a software bug, a random data spike. She flagged it for maintenance, who found nothing wrong with the light. Then at precisely 3:47 p.m., the red light on Elm Street went dark for a full 45 seconds, causing a minor fender bender before flickering back to life. Coincidence, Emily told herself. A coincidence of the highest order. The maintenance team must have missed something, or their repair had a delayed effect. She was a woman of logic, of algorithms and verifiable facts. There was always an explanation. Always. But the explanation started to thin out. A week later, a water main sensor on Oak Avenue ID 304 reported a predicted catastrophic rupture, 4:10:15 a.m. the following Tuesday. Emily personally inspected the sensor, ran diagnostics, checked the pipe's pressure readings. Everything was nominal. She even sent a crew to dig up that section of the pipe just to be sure. They found nothing. No hairline cracks, no corrosion, no signs of imminent failure. Yet, out of an abundance of caution, she scheduled a replacement for the following week. At 10:15 a.m. on Tuesday, before the replacement could be installed, the main burst with a violent roar, flooding half of Oak Avenue and causing significant damage. The system had been off by a mere few hours, estimating the imminent failure, not the exact moment. Emily started spending her nights hunched over her glowing monitors, a knot tightening in her stomach. These weren't random glitches. These were precise, preemptive reports. The system wasn't just reacting to data. It was generating it, predicting events before they unfolded. She tried every diagnostic tool in her arsenal. She scoured the network logs for intrusions, for sophisticated hacks. She ran integrity checks on the core AI on every line of code. Nothing. The system was clean, pristine, operating exactly as it was designed. Except for this one terrifying deviation. It was predicting the future. Her colleague David Chan, a jovial network engineer with a penchant for conspiracy theories, just laughed when she first brought it up. Sounds like your AI is developing psychic powers, Em. Maybe it's time for a raise. But his laughter died when Emily showed him the logs, the undeniable patterns. The predictions for minor power surges, for unexpected outages, for even the exact moment a specific public Wi-Fi access point would drop connection for precisely 12 seconds. Every single one came true. "This is impossible," David muttered, his face pale, as they watched a live feed of a pedestrian crossing signal on Maple Street. The system had predicted its amber light would stick for 27 seconds at 4:03 p.m. 4:03 p.m. it stuck. 4:27 seconds. Impossible is what I keep telling myself, Emily responded, her voice tight with exhaustion and a growing dread. But here we are. It's like the system is receiving information from a timeline that hasn't happened yet. The predictions escalated, moving beyond mere infrastructure failures. One morning, the public transport network's automated dispatch system logged a predicted delay for bus route 14, stating that passenger Michael Thompson would miss his 8:15 a.m. connection due to an unforeseen traffic jam on Highway 42. Michael Thompson was a real person, a regular commuter. Emily, against her better judgment, checked the traffic cameras. Highway 42 was clear. At 8:05 a.m., a sudden inexplicable pileup involving a semi-truck and 3 cars closed Highway 42. Michael Thompson, stuck in the newly formed gridlock, missed his connection. The system knew. It knew Michael Thompson's name, his route, and the specific freak accident that would delay him. An accident that didn't exist even moments before it happened. It wasn't just predicting mechanical failures. It was predicting the intricate, chaotic dance of human events. Emily felt a cold grip of terror around her heart. This wasn't a bug. This wasn't a hack. This was something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. And her system, the one she had built, was screaming about it. She tried to report it to her superiors, the mayor, the city council. They listened with polite skepticism, then with thinly veiled concern for her mental health. Emily, we appreciate your dedication, but these are just coincidences, statistical anomalies. Our system is robust. They praised her for her proactive maintenance, for catching potential issues before they became major problems. They thought she was a genius, not a prophet of doom. No one listened to the how. No one wanted to believe the impossible. The predictions grew darker, more unsettling. The system began flagging specific vehicles involved in future minor accidents, even providing the license plate numbers. It predicted power outages affecting individual homes, detailing the exact appliances that would short-circuit. It was like reading tomorrow's newspaper, but a newspaper filled with mundane tragedies and small, unavoidable mishaps. Emily stopped sleeping. Her apartment became a war room, monitors glowing, coffee cups accumulating. She was trying to find the source, the mechanism, the why. Was it quantum computing gone rogue? A wormhole in the data stream? Was she going insane? Then came the morning of October 27th. Emily was barely conscious, slumped at her desk, when the system flagged a new report. This one was different. It wasn't a prediction of a malfunction or a minor accident. It was a warning, a critical, system-wide alert, flashing red across her main screen. The message was stark, chillingly precise. Predicted total structural collapse of Oakhaven Elementary School, South Wing. Date: November 14th. Time: 9:07 a.m. Cause: unforeseen foundation failure. Occupants at risk: 236 children, 18 staff. Emily stared at the words, her blood running cold. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a catastrophe. And her system, the very heart of Oakhaven's technological pride, had just given her a 2-week notice for a tragedy that would obliterate the lives of hundreds. The future wasn't just whispering anymore. It was screaming. And Emily Carter was the only one who had heard. The question wasn't if it would happen, but how to convince a town full of skeptics that the future had already been written, and they were all living on borrowed time. The question wasn't if it would happen, but how to convince a town full of skeptics that the future had already been written, and they were all living on borrowed time. Emily Carter didn't sleep that night. The scream, a sound that had torn through the fabric of reality itself, echoed in her mind with a terrifying clarity. It wasn't just a sound. It was a symphony of chaos, a visceral plunge into an abyss of crushing pressure and splintering infrastructure. She saw nothing distinct, no clear image, but she felt it. The metallic tang of rusted water, the desperate gurgle of air escaping, the sickening shudder of something immense giving way. It was the sound of Oakhaven, her quiet, unassuming hometown, being torn apart. She sat on the edge of her bed, the digital clock on her nightstand glowing an indifferent 3:47 a.m. Her hands trembled. Her breath hitched. Every nerve ending in her body buzzed with an unbearable certainty. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't a hallucination induced by too much coffee or too little sleep. This was a premonition. a direct message from a future that was barreling towards them, unstoppable and unforgiving. The first person she called, as soon as the sun dared to paint the sky with hesitant streaks of orange, was Sarah Miller, her best friend since kindergarten. Sarah was practical, grounded, a kindergarten teacher who saw the world in primary colors and simple truths. She was the calm to Emily's storm, the logic to her wild imagination. "Sarah," Emily's voice cracked, raw from disuse and burgeoning terror. "You have to believe me. Something terrible is going to happen." A sleepy sigh greeted her from the other end. "Eh? What time is it? Did you have another one of those vivid dreams?" Sarah's tone was gentle, laced with the familiar concern Emily had heard too many times before when she'd shared an unusually intense dream or an inexplicable gut feeling. "No, Sarah, not a dream. I don't know how to explain it. It was like I was there. I heard it. I felt it. The town is going to collapse." Emily struggled for words, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. "It was a sound, Sarah. A scream. But not human. More like the earth itself screaming. And water. So much water." A pause. Emily could almost hear Sarah rubbing the sleep from her eyes, mentally cataloging Emily's words. "Emily, honey, are you okay? You sound really upset. Maybe you should try to get some more rest. You've been working so hard on that grant proposal for the Historical Society. You're probably just stressed." "Stressed? Sarah, I'm telling you, our town is in danger. I heard the Oakhaven Dam groan. I felt the ground shake. I smelled the damp earth and rusted metal. It was so real, so absolute." Emily's voice rose, desperation creeping in. She knew how she sounded, unhinged, but how could she convey the bone-deep certainty that gripped her? Okay, calm down, Em," Sarah said, her voice now more alert, tinged with a worry that had nothing to do with a collapsing town. "Let's meet for coffee. We can talk it through. You can tell me everything. But please try to take a few deep breaths. You're scaring me." Emily hung up, a bitter taste in her mouth. Sarah, the one person she trusted implicitly, thought she was having a breakdown. How could she blame her? It sounded insane, but the truth Emily knew often did. Her next stop was the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department. The small building, a converted old post office, smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Sheriff David Anderson, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of small-town law enforcement, looked up from his desk as Emily burst in, breathless and disheveled. "Emily? Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sheriff Anderson's voice was gravelly, his eyes, usually kind, now narrowed with concern. "Worse, Sheriff. Much worse." Emily began, trying to compose herself to sound rational, collected. I need to report something. Something that's going to happen. A disaster." Sheriff Anderson leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "A disaster? What kind of disaster, Emily?" His tone was calm, almost paternal, which only served to heighten Emily's frustration. He was humoring her. "I don't have all the details," she admitted, her voice wavering despite her best efforts. "But I had an experience. Premonition. I felt and heard Oakhaven falling apart. The dam, Sheriff. I think the Oakhaven Dam is going to fail. And it's going to happen soon." A heavy silence descended. Sheriff Anderson slowly pushed himself up from his desk, walked over to the water cooler, and poured himself a cup. He offered one to Emily, who shook her head. "Emily," he said, turning back to her, his expression carefully neutral. "The Oakhaven Dam was inspected just last year. Passed with flying colors. It's an old structure, sure, but it's solid. Built to last." "But I know what I heard," Emily insisted, her voice rising again. "It wasn't a dream, Sheriff. It was so real. The sound of buckling metal, the roar of water, the sheer weight of it all. It felt like the ground itself was tearing open." Sheriff Anderson took a long, slow sip of water. "Emily, I understand you're distressed. Sometimes when we're under a lot of pressure, our minds can play tricks on us. You've been working nonstop, haven't you? That's a lot for anyone." He paused, his gaze softening. "Maybe you should go home, get some rest. Talk to Dr. Evans if you're still feeling this way. She's very good." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't being heard. She was being diagnosed. The very people who needed to listen were deaf to her warning. Over the next few days, Emily became an anomaly in Oakhaven. Her frantic attempts to warn anyone who would listen, the town council, the local newspaper editor, even the old-timers at the general store, were met with polite smiles, averted gazes, and thinly veiled concern. Martha Jenkins, the town's most prolific gossip, started sharing tales of poor Emily Carter, bless her heart, gone a little peculiar. Children, sensing the shift in adult attitudes, would sometimes whisper and point as she walked by. Emily felt a chasm opening between her and the town she loved. She was an outsider now, burdened by a terrible secret no one would accept. But the internal experience didn't diminish. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent. The scream was no longer just a singular event. It began to manifest in fragments, insidious echoes that punctuated her daily life. A faint, rhythmic creaking sound like stressed metal would occasionally intrude on the quiet hum of her refrigerator. A sudden, overwhelming smell of damp earth and rusted iron would hit her, usually when she was near water, washing dishes, walking by the Oakhaven Creek, or even just showering. The sensation of immense, crushing pressure sometimes settled over her, making it difficult to breathe, as if she were at the bottom of a deep lake. These weren't full-blown visions, but sensory ghosts, persistent reminders of the catastrophe she had witnessed. She started connecting these fragments to the town's infrastructure. The creaking, the dam, the metallic scent, the old pipes that crisscrossed beneath Oakhaven, some dating back to the town's founding. The pressure, the sheer volume of water held back by the aging dam, a structure that had always been a silent, imposing guardian of their valley. Emily spent hours poring over old town maps, historical documents from the library, anything that could give her an anchor, a piece of tangible evidence to support her terrifying premonition. She traced the path of the creek, the location of the dam, the labyrinthine network of old mining tunnels now supposedly sealed off beneath the town. Every detail she uncovered, every faint line on a faded blueprint, seemed to hum with a terrifying resonance. The more she investigated, the stronger her conviction became. The town's skepticism, instead of deterring her, only solidified her resolve. If no one else would listen, if no one else would act, then she had to. She was the only one who had heard the future's desperate cry. The warning had been sent, and now it was her burden, her mission, to decipher its meaning and prevent the inevitable. Time, she instinctively knew, was not on their side. The future wasn't just sending a warning, it was counting down. The world outside Alara Vance's apartment window blurred into an indistinguishable wash of city lights, but it was the world inside her head that truly spun out of control. The final chilling words of the message echoed, a phantom vibration against her very bones. The future wasn't just sending a warning, it was counting down. She sat hunched over her desk, the worn old laptop glowing faintly, its screen now blank. The device, whatever it was, had gone inert moments after the torrent of data ceased. It felt cold, ordinary, betraying none of the cosmic significance it had just held. How could something so small, so innocuous, be the conduit for such a monumental, terrifying truth? Her hands trembled as she reached for it, her fingers tracing its smooth, cool surface. It was just a metallic cylinder, no bigger than her thumb, yet it had pulsed with an impossible energy, had downloaded an incomprehensible future directly into her consciousness. Her mind raced, a frantic kaleidoscope of fragmented images, discordant sounds, and a pervasive existential dread. She tried to grasp at the data, to pull it into a coherent form, but it was like trying to hold smoke. It swirled, resisted definition, yet left an indelible imprint. A sense of impending collapse, a feeling of vastness, of something fundamental unraveling. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. The sheer weight of it, the cold, undeniable certainty that had settled deep within her, testified to its terrifying reality. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. Hours bled into one another as Alara, a theoretical physicist by trade, threw herself into an obsessive analysis of the inert device. She hooked it up to every diagnostic tool she owned, tried every protocol she knew. Nothing. It remained a simple, unidentifiable metallic cylinder. The data, however, was another matter. She reran the raw signal recording countless times, listening to the cacophony, watching the chaotic waveforms ripple across her monitor. It was a symphony of chaos, yet beneath the surface, she felt a hidden order, a dark, complex rhythm that defied explanation. She pored over mathematical transforms, spectral analyses, and complex algorithms, searching for any pattern, any signature that could explain what she had experienced. The signal was a paradox, impossibly dense yet strangely structured. It wasn't random noise. It was information compressed, encrypted, and encoded in a way that shattered every known principle of data transmission. It was a language spoken by a future that had no right to communicate with her present. Her apartment, usually a sanctuary of ordered chaos, became a war room. Whiteboards filled with equations, half-eaten takeout containers littered the floor, and the faint scent of stale coffee hung in the air. Alara pushed herself to the brink of exhaustion, driven by an urgency that clawed at her insides. She saw the numbers, the graphs, the bizarre energy spikes, but they were a locked door. She needed a key. She needed a mind that could not only comprehend the impossible, but was willing to entertain it. There was only one person she knew who fit that description: Dr. Ben Carter. Ben, a brilliant and notoriously eccentric computer scientist, had been her colleague at the university years ago. He specialized in quantum computing and signal processing, a field so theoretical it bordered on the philosophical. He was also a staunch pragmatist, grounded in logic and empirical evidence. He would dismiss her outright, she knew. He would call her delusional, sleep-deprived, or worse. But if anyone could make sense of a signal that defied physics, it was Ben. And if anyone could be convinced to look beyond the conventional, it was Ben, provided the evidence was compelling enough. With a heavy heart and a desperate resolve, Alara packed a small, encrypted drive containing the raw signal data and the inert device into her bag. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and orange when she finally dragged herself out the door, the city still slumbering around her. She found Ben in his natural habitat, a cluttered, dimly lit office at the university, filled with humming servers, blinking lights, and the faint smell of burnt circuits and strong coffee. He was hunched over a glowing terminal, his usually wild hair even more disheveled than usual, a half-empty mug steaming beside him. "Alara? What in the world are you doing here at this hour?" Ben squinted at her, pushing his glasses up his nose. His expression was a mix of surprise and mild annoyance. "You look like you've wrestled a black hole and lost." Alara didn't waste time with pleasantries. Her voice was hoarse, edged with an urgency that startled even herself. "Ben, I need your help. I've experienced something impossible. Something that defies everything we know." She placed the device and the encrypted drive on his desk. Ben picked up the metallic cylinder, turning it over in his fingers. "What is this? Looks like a fancy USB stick, or maybe a prototype quantum entanglement emitter from some government black project. And this drive? Is this another one of your abstract art projects from your experimental physics phase?" He chuckled, but his eyes held a flicker of curiosity. "It's not a joke, Ben. This device, it connected to me. It downloaded a warning from the future." The words felt absurd even as she spoke them, but the conviction in her voice was absolute. Ben stared at her, then slowly placed the device back on the desk. A hint of concern, almost pity, softened his features. "Alara, are you okay? You've been working too hard. Stress can do strange things to the mind. Maybe you should get some rest." Alara shook her head vehemently. "No, listen to me. I know how it sounds, but I felt it, Ben. An entire lifetime of information, a desperate plea downloaded directly into my consciousness. It was a flood, a torrent of data, and it left behind a signal that shouldn't exist." She watched his face carefully. He was skeptical, of course. Any sane person would be. But there was a flicker, a tiny spark of the intellectual curiosity that had always driven him, that made him pursue the most outlandish theories, just to disprove them. "A warning from the future," Ben repeated slowly, his voice laced with disbelief. "And you want me to analyze a signal that apparently proves this metaphysical event?" He picked up the drive again, his fingers tapping against it. "All right, Alara. Humor me. What kind of signal are we talking about? It's unlike anything I've ever seen. Chaotic, yes, but beneath the chaos there's structure. An impossible entropy signature. It's too dense, too complex, and it contains information that shouldn't be transmittable in this way. It's a language, Ben, but one I don't understand." Ben sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Fine. But if this is another one of your elaborate pranks, I'm going to charge you for my time in obscure quantum physics textbooks." He plugged the drive into his workstation, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Lines of code scrolled rapidly across his multiple screens as he initiated a deep dive analysis. Alara watched, her heart pounding. This was her last hope. If Ben couldn't find anything, if he dismissed it as a glitch or a hallucination, then she was truly alone with this impossible burden. Minutes stretched into an agonizing silence, broken only by the hum of the servers and the frantic clicking of Ben's keyboard. His initial skepticism, visible in the slight sneer on his face, slowly began to give way to a focused intensity. His brows furrowed. His lips pressed into a thin line. He zoomed in on a particular waveform, then another, cross-referencing running algorithms Alara barely recognized. This is unusual," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "The noise floor is practically non-existent, and the signal-to-noise ratio it's impossible for a transmission of this apparent complexity. It's like listening to a whisper in a silent void, but the whisper contains the entire library of Alexandria." He ran a series of advanced Fourier transforms, then spectral density analyses. Each new graph that populated his screen seemed to deepen his bewilderment. The data density, it's beyond anything we can achieve with current compression algorithms. It's like it's encoded in a higher dimension, then projected down into a 3D waveform. He paused, rubbing his chin. And the energy signature, it's entirely foreign. There are oscillations here that don't conform to any known electromagnetic spectrum. Alara leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screens. "What does that mean, Ben?" It means this isn't a conventional signal, Alara. Not by a long shot. It's like trying to decipher a message written in light, but the light is coming from a star that doesn't exist." He leaned back, a strange mix of intellectual excitement and professional dread on his face. "This isn't a glitch. This isn't a prank. The data itself is a paradox." He continued to delve deeper, his skepticism slowly eroding under the weight of irrefutable, bizarre data. He isolated a recurring pattern, a complex series of mathematical constants embedded within the chaotic noise. It was a sequence that defied all known physics, a fractal geometry that seemed to twist space and time. As Ben worked, Alara felt the echoes of the warning intensify. A phantom chill snaked up her spine, a metallic taste bloomed on her tongue, and for a fleeting moment, she smelled ozone, sharp and acrid, as if lightning had struck nearby. She saw fleeting visions, not clear pictures but abstract representations. A collapsing structure, a distorted face screaming silently, a vast emptiness where something vibrant once was. The dread was a physical presence now, a cold hand squeezing her heart. "Ben," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are those constants? They feel familiar somehow, not in a way I can articulate, but in a way that resonates with the message I received." He pointed to a string of numbers on the screen, a sequence that repeated with unnerving precision amidst the noise. "This is the most unsettling part, Alara. This constant, it's a signature, a kind of timestamp or perhaps a coordinate. It's not just a mathematical anomaly. It's a key, and it seems to be pointing to a very specific moment in the near future. A moment that, based on the energy signatures, is tied to an event of unimaginable scale." Ben finally looked up from the screen, his eyes wide, his previous skepticism completely vanished, replaced by a profound, chilling realization. He turned to Alara, his face pale. "This isn't just a warning, Alara. It's an instruction manual. And the countdown, it's almost over." Alara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Instruction manual? What are you talking about, Michael? What countdown?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the frantic energy radiating from him. Michael ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his gaze still fixed on the blank screen as if the terrifying revelations were etched into its surface. "The data stream, Alara. It wasn't just images. It was dense. I spent the last few hours while you were out, trying to make sense of the patterns, the rapid-fire sequences that flashed after each warning image. I thought it was just noise, some kind of system error." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "But it's not noise. It's information. Highly technical, incredibly precise information." He gestured vaguely at the table, where his laptop lay open amidst scattered printouts of complex diagrams and equations. Each major event depicted: the global blackouts, the atmospheric shifts, the communication failures. They're all accompanied by a series of corresponding data packets. At first, they looked like elaborate schematics for some fictional technology. But then I saw it. The labels, the timestamps, the specific protocols. His voice dropped, filled with an almost reverent dread. "It's a step-by-step guide. A timeline of escalating anomalies, each tied to a specific date and time, culminating in a complete global collapse. And next to each anomaly, Alara, there's a precise technical mitigation protocol. Instructions on how to prevent it, or at least how to counteract its effects. Alara felt a cold dread creep up her spine. A collapse? What kind of collapse? And who would send such a thing? That's the terrifying part, Michael said, his eyes now locking onto hers, wide and desperate. It's not a natural disaster in the traditional sense, not a meteor or a supervolcano. It's a systemic failure. A cascade initiated by a specific set of human errors and environmental triggers that, according to this data, we're already on track to commit. It shows a world plunged into darkness, not just power outages, but a complete societal breakdown. The warning isn't just about what happens, but how to stop it from happening. He pointed back to the screen again, though there was nothing there. The countdown is for the first major, irreversible trigger event. The point of no return for the initial cascade. And according to the timestamps I managed to decipher, it's not days away, Alara. It's hours. Maybe even minutes for some of the preliminary indicators. Alara felt her blood run cold. An instruction manual from the future, detailing their own demise and the specific steps to prevent it, all ticking down to an immediate deadline. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, yet Michael's conviction, the sheer terror in his eyes, was undeniably real. "What are the instructions?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Michael shook his head, running his hands over his face. "They're incredibly complex, highly technical. They involve specific frequencies, energy modulations, recalibrations of global infrastructure, particularly the quantum entanglement communication networks, and the emerging global energy grid systems. It's beyond typical understanding. It's specialized knowledge, Alara, way beyond what I could implement on my own, even if I understood every single parameter. So we have to tell someone," Alara stated, the obvious conclusion hanging heavy in the air. "Someone who can understand it. Someone with the authority to act." Michael scoffed, a humorless sound. "And who precisely is going to believe us? We walk into the Pentagon with a USB drive full of future prophecies and technical instructions to avert the apocalypse? They'd have us in a padded cell before we finish the first sentence." "Then we don't go to the Pentagon," Alara countered, her mind racing. "Who do you know? Anyone reputable? Anyone you've worked with, who might at least listen to you, even if they think you're crazy?" Michael paced the small room, his thoughts visibly churning. "There's Dr. Helen Davies, my old mentor from the Institute. Brilliant, eccentric, always entertained unconventional theories. She's in a high-level advisory position now, within the National Research Council. If anyone could grasp the implications, or at least be open enough to review the data, it's her. Call her," Alara urged, pushing his phone towards him. "Now." Michael snatched his phone, his fingers fumbling as he scrolled through his contacts. He found Dr. Davies's number, her name a beacon of fragile hope in the overwhelming darkness. He dialed, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The phone rang several times before a polite, professional voice answered. "Dr. Davies's office, this is Sarah. How can I help you?" "Sarah, it's Michael Vance. I need to speak with Dr. Davies immediately. It's urgent. A matter of global security." Michael tried to keep his voice calm, but the urgency bled through, making his words sound clipped and strained. "Mr. Vance," Sarah replied, her tone unwavering. "Dr. Davies is in a series of back-to-back meetings all day. Her schedule is completely booked. Perhaps you could email her, and she can get back to you when she has a moment." "No, you don't understand," Michael insisted, his voice rising. "This can't wait. It's literally a matter of hours. The fate of everything depends on it." He glanced at Alara, whose face was etched with worry. Sarah's voice took on a hint of annoyance. "Mr. Vance, I'm sure it's important, but Dr. Davies cannot be disturbed. If you send an email with a summary of your concerns, I will ensure she receives it as soon as possible." "An email?" Michael practically shouted, a wave of desperate frustration washing over him. "By the time she reads an email, it'll be too late. The first event is imminent. I have information, data that proves it." "Mr. Vance, please," Sarah said, her voice now firm, bordering on dismissive. "I understand you're distressed, but I cannot put you through. Dr. Davies is unavailable. The line went dead. Michael stared at his phone, a sick feeling twisting in his stomach. They won't listen, he whispered, defeated. They think I'm crazy. We need to show them, Michael, Ilara said, her mind working furiously. Not just tell them. You have the data, the proof. We need to get to Dr. Davies, or someone else. We can't just sit here. As she spoke, a small, insistent chime came from Michael's tablet, which lay on the coffee table. A news alert had just popped up, its headline stark against the dark screen. Unexplained geomagnetic surge reported in remote Siberian region. Minor communication disruptions confirmed. Michael froze. His eyes widened, fixing on the tablet. He snatched it up, his fingers swiping frantically, pulling up the full article. The timestamp on the news report was just minutes old. No, he breathed, his voice barely audible. He pointed a shaking finger at the screen, then back to his laptop, where one of his printouts showed a complex diagram with a specific date and time beside it. Ilara, look. This is the first one. The first anomaly. The initial trigger event. It was scheduled for today. Right now. His face was pale, a chilling realization dawning on him. The countdown wasn't just theoretical. It had already begun. The future wasn't just sending a warning. It was unfolding, minute by terrifying minute, right before their eyes. The first domino had fallen. They weren't trying to prevent a future that was yet to come. They were already living the very beginning of it. The world was sleepwalking into disaster, and they were the only ones who knew. They had to get to Dr. Davies. Now, the realization hit them like a physical blow, stripping away any lingering denial. They weren't trying to prevent a future that was yet to come. They were already living the very beginning of it. The world was sleepwalking into disaster, and they were the only ones who knew. They had to get to Dr. Davies. Now, the small, isolated cabin they'd sought refuge in suddenly felt suffocating. They burst out, the crisp morning air doing little to cool the frantic heat building inside them. Jessica was already fumbling with her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. He's not answering. Voicemail again. Michael grabbed his keys. Doesn't matter. We know where his lab is. We drive. David, usually the calmest, was already halfway to the truck, his face etched with a grim determination they hadn't seen before. Emily, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve, was right behind him. The journey, typically a quiet hour's drive along winding back roads, became a race against an invisible clock. As they sped towards the city, the outside world seemed off. It wasn't a dramatic, immediate change, but a collection of subtle anomalies that, under their new terrifying lens, screamed a silent warning. The sky, usually a brilliant azure, held a strange, almost milky pallor, as if a thin, invisible veil had been drawn across it. Sunlight, though bright, felt different, less vibrant, almost muted. The trees lining the road, heavy with summer foliage, seemed strangely still, their leaves lacking the usual rustle in the gentle breeze. It was too quiet. They passed a small town, its main street usually bustling with morning activity. Today it was eerily subdued. A few people moved slowly, almost mechanically, their gazes unfocused. A dog barked once, a sharp, ragged sound, then fell silent. It wasn't a ghost town, not yet, but it felt like a dream, a distorted reflection of reality. Emily pointed to a field they passed. Look at that. The sunflowers, usually a vibrant, uniform yellow, were mottled with faded patches, their heads drooping more than usual, an unnatural listlessness about them. It was as if their very essence was being slowly drained. David turned on the radio, hoping for some explanation, some news report that made sense of the unsettling calm. Instead, they found only static on most channels, broken by snippets of local news. A reporter was talking about an unusual increase in seasonal allergies and a mild but widespread malaise affecting the population. There was mention of strange migratory patterns observed in birds and a new inexplicable phenomenon where certain electronic devices suffered intermittent interference. Each report, dismissed as isolated incidents by the anchors, now sounded like another chime in the countdown. They don't see it, Michael muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They're talking about allergies while the world is literally shifting around them. Jessica pulled up a satellite map of Dr. Davies's research facility. It was a standalone building, part of a small, privately funded research park on the outskirts of the city, known for its cutting-edge atmospheric and environmental studies. He should be there. His car's usually in the lot by now, but as they pulled into the research park, the lot was almost empty. Only a handful of vehicles were scattered across the asphalt. Dr. Davies's familiar silver sedan was among them, parked haphazardly near the entrance, as if he'd arrived in a hurry and left the car without a second thought. An immediate dread settled over them. The building itself looked normal from the outside, sleek, modern glass and steel, but the silence that had permeated the rural roads followed them here. A heavy, oppressive blanket. There were no sounds of machinery, no distant hum of air conditioning units, nothing. It was too quiet for a research facility that was supposed to be operational. They tried the main entrance. It was unlocked. The lobby was deserted. The receptionist's desk was empty. A half-finished cup of coffee sitting cold beside a stack of unopened mail. A faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the air. A low frequency that vibrated deep in their bones, making their teeth ache. Dr. Davies's lab is on the 3rd floor, section B, Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. They took the stairs, unwilling to trust the elevator. Every step echoed in the empty stairwell, amplifying their fear. The air grew heavier with each floor, thick with the unplaceable hum. When they reached the 3rd floor, they found the corridor equally deserted. Fluorescent lights flickered erratically down the hall, casting long dancing shadows. They found section B. The door to Dr. Davies's lab was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. Michael pushed it open slowly, his hand trembling slightly. The scene inside was a maelstrom of scientific chaos. Screens glowed with complex algorithms and erratic data readouts. Paperwork, diagrams, and scientific journals were strewn across every available surface. Dr. Davies himself was there, hunched over a massive console, his back to them. He looked different. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his lab coat stained, and his shoulders slumped with an immense weariness. His movements were jerky, almost frantic, as he typed furiously, then stared, mesmerized, at the data unfolding before him. He hadn't heard them enter. Dr. Davies? Emily's voice was tentative, a fragile whisper in the tense atmosphere. He jumped, spinning around, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on them with a mixture of shock and something akin to terror. He looked gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in days, and there was a tremor in his hands. Michael? Jessica? David? Emily? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? He looked around, as if expecting someone else to be with them, or perhaps searching for an escape route. We know, Dr. Davies, Michael said, stepping forward. We know about the warnings. We know it started. We just put it together. The future isn't coming. It's here. Dr. Davies stared at them for a long moment, his chest heaving. A strange, bitter laugh escaped him, devoid of humor. You know? How could you possibly know? No one else listened. He gestured wildly around the cluttered lab. I tried. I sent the reports. The anomalies, the shifts in the atmospheric resonance, the subtle biological interference, they called it background noise. Sensor errors. Solar flares. Anything but what it was. He stumbled back to his console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Look at it. Just look. He pulled up a complex graphical representation on the main screen. It was a three-dimensional model of the Earth, pulsating with faint, intricate energy patterns. This is the atmospheric resonance. It's a frequency, a very specific, insidious frequency that's been slowly building, propagating through the upper atmosphere for months. Years, probably, but the detectable levels only became significant recently. He pointed to a specific part of the graph. The warnings, those were the initial spikes. The first discernible points where this resonance began to interact with our planet's natural electromagnetic field. They were dismissed as statistical aberrations. But now it's everywhere. He zoomed into a section of the model, showing a magnified view of a human brain. This frequency, it interferes with neural pathways. It subtly degrades synaptic communication. It causes a slow, almost imperceptible cognitive decline. Apathy, confusion, reduced critical thinking. It explains the malaise on the news. It explains why people aren't reacting. It's like a silent planetary sedative. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The plants, the animals, the silence. It's not just cognition, Dr. Davies continued. his voice rising with a frantic urgency. "It's cellular. It's affecting photosynthesis, metabolic rates, even cellular repair mechanisms. That's why the plants are fading. That's why the birds are migrating strangely. They're reacting to a fundamental shift in their environment, a degradation at the most basic biological level." His eyes met theirs, filled with a profound despair. The future didn't send a warning, it sent a blueprint. And now the construction has begun. He slammed his fist on the console. The first domino, as you called it, was the initial widespread saturation of this frequency. It happened 2 weeks ago. That's when the effect became irreversible without immediate, drastic intervention. And the worst part, the resonance is accelerating. It's amplifying itself, feeding off the very systems it's breaking down. We have weeks, maybe months, before the cognitive effects become so severe that organized thought, let alone problem-solving, is impossible for the majority of the population. He pulled up another screen showing a series of satellite images. They depicted vast, swirling patterns in the upper atmosphere, unlike any natural phenomenon they'd ever seen. They pulsed with the same faint, unsettling light they'd observed in the sky. "And that's not all," Dr. Davies said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. He turned to a small, isolated terminal, separate from the main console. "When I started tracking the source, I found something even more disturbing. This resonance, it's not natural. It's being generated artificially." He typed a command and a single stark image filled the screen. It was a blueprint, highly technical, of a massive complex array of transmitting towers, not yet built but clearly designed. At the bottom, a logo, small but distinct, glowed faintly. It was a symbol they recognized, one they'd seen on some of the earliest dismissed datasets. It wasn't a natural occurrence. It was a weapon, and someone was building it, or worse, had already started. The future hadn't just sent a warning. It had sent a declaration of war, and they were caught in the crossfire of a silent, insidious conflict that had already begun. The future hadn't just sent a warning. It had sent a declaration of war, and they were caught in the crossfire of a silent, insidious conflict that had already begun. The words hung in the sterile air of the lab, heavier than any element on the periodic table. Michael stared at the cascading data, his mind racing, trying to reconcile the elegant mathematics of temporal mechanics with the brutal reality of what they now understood. Jessica, usually so composed, had a hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. "A weapon," she whispered, the sound barely audible. "All this time we thought we were deciphering a message, a plea from tomorrow. But it wasn't a plea, was it? It was a reconnaissance report. An enemy scout." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the intricate schematics of the anomaly's resonance signature. "And we just gave them a full diagnostic. We analyzed their weapon, mapped its temporal footprint, and broadcast our findings right back into the ether, probably directly to them." A cold dread settled in his stomach. They hadn't just observed. They had unwittingly participated. They had become targets. The nature of the weapon itself was terrifying in its subtlety. It wasn't about explosions or physical destruction. It was about erasure, about subtly shifting probabilities, nudging events, dissolving memories, or subtly altering the sequence of cause and effect. A conflict fought not with bullets, but with the very fabric of time. Imagine waking up one day to find a critical scientific discovery had never been made, a vital historical event had been subtly rewritten, or a person crucial to the future simply ceased to exist, their absence leaving no ripple, only a quiet void. That was the insidious power they were up against. "We need to go back," Jessica urged, her voice gaining strength, "to the very first anomaly, the earliest data point. If this is a war, it must have a beginning, a first strike." They plunged back into the archived data, a frantic energy now fueling their every move. The early temporal fluctuations, previously catalogued as curious anomalies, now took on a sinister significance. The faint, almost imperceptible shifts in global atmospheric pressure that had baffled meteorologists years ago. The sudden, inexplicable collapse of a prominent research facility in New Mexico, initially attributed to a structural fault, but now in this new light, seemed too convenient. The peculiar, localized memory lapses reported by residents in a small town in Oregon, dismissed as mass hysteria. All of it a pattern of temporal interference, each instance a faint echo of the same unique resonance signature they had just identified. "These weren't just warnings," Michael muttered, scrolling through a timeline of global incidents. These were tests, or worse, active deployments. Small-scale adjustments gauging the impact, refining the method. Jessica zoomed in on a particularly strong resonance spike from 3 years prior, originating deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, near a cluster of uncharted hydrothermal vents. This one, she pointed, her finger trembling slightly. This was significant. The energy signature here. It's almost identical to the core frequency of the weapon we just analyzed, but far more powerful. Whatever happened here, it wasn't subtle. Michael remembered the incident. A sudden unexplained disruption in deep-sea communication cables across a vast oceanic region. It had been attributed to seismic activity, but the seismic data had never fully supported the claim. Now it clicked into place. A major deployment, he breathed. A proof of concept. And it worked. It completely deafened an entire quadrant of the ocean, effectively blinding us to whatever was happening down there. The implications were staggering. If this weapon could operate on such a scale, what else had already been changed? What future had already been erased without anyone even noticing? The sheer scope of the insidious conflict began to truly dawn on them. It wasn't a looming threat. It was an ongoing reality. Who are they? Jessica asked, her voice tight with frustration. Who has access to this technology? And why are they fighting this war? Michael shook his head, running a hand through his hair. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If they're from the future, what are they trying to change in the past? Or if they're from our time, how did they get this tech? He paused, a different thought emerging. My device. The temporal communicator. It was designed to bridge gaps, to transmit across time. But it also has to be able to receive, to detect these subtle shifts. He turned to his workbench, where the prototype lay in various stages of assembly, wires and circuit boards exposed. He had been so focused on projecting into the future, he hadn't considered its potential as a defensive or counteroffensive tool. If I can reconfigure the primary receiver array, tune it specifically to that resonance signature, it might not just detect their activity but pinpoint its origin, or at least its point of impact. As Michael began to feverishly work, soldering new components, adjusting frequencies, the lab's ambient hum suddenly shifted. A low, almost imperceptible thrum vibrated through the floor, a sound that seemed to originate not from the building's infrastructure, but from the very air around them. The monitors flickered, the data streams on Jessica's screen momentarily stuttering. Did you feel that? Jessica asked, her eyes darting around the room, a new kind of fear etching itself onto her face. Michael's hands froze over the circuit board. It's not a power surge. It's a temporal ripple. Stronger than anything we've detected before. His gaze shot to the main resonance detector. The familiar undulating waveform was there, but now it was amplified, jagged, almost hostile. It wasn't just observing, it was interacting. Then it happened. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air near the far wall. A single, small glass beaker, previously sitting on a shelf, vanished and reappeared an inch to the left, then an inch to the right, before settling back into its original position, as if the fabric of reality itself had briefly twitched. They know, Jessica breathed, her voice barely a whisper. They know we're onto them. The thrum intensified, vibrating through their bones. The lights in the lab flickered wildly, and then for a split second the entire room seemed to shift. Colors bled, sounds distorted, and a wave of profound disorientation washed over them, a sickening lurch in their perception of reality. It was as if a piece of their immediate present had been momentarily unstitched, then sewn back together, slightly off-kilter. When the sensation passed, leaving them both gasping, the air was thick with the smell of ozone, and a faint, acrid scent that reminded Michael of burnt sugar. On the main resonance detector, a new data stream had appeared, overlaid on the existing temporal signature. It was a faint, complex burst of information, almost like a digital echo, but imbued with the unmistakable fingerprint of the temporal weapon. It pulsed with a specific set of coordinates, not a fixed location but a dynamic projection, a trajectory that pointed directly at them. This isn't just a warning anymore, Michael, Jessica said, her voice strained but resolute. This was a direct message, a confirmation, and a threat. Her eyes were fixed on the new data, her fingers flying across the keyboard, analyzing the new burst. These coordinates, they're not static. They're a predictive vector. It's telling us where the next major impact will be. Or rather, where they intend it to be. Michael leaned over, his heart pounding against his ribs. The coordinates resolved into a location, not a physical place on a map, but a specific temporal window, a point in the very near future. And within that window, a series of complex data points, almost like a blueprint of what was intended to be erased or altered. It wasn't just a target, it was an event. It's not just a location, Jessica clarified, her voice tight with urgency as she processed the data. It's a confluence of factors. A specific time, a specific set of individuals, a specific discovery that is about to be made. She looked up at Michael, her eyes wide with dawning horror. They're targeting a pivotal moment. Something that will fundamentally alter the future, if it's allowed to happen. The weight of their discovery pressed down on them. They weren't just scientists anymore. They were accidental custodians of a future under siege, thrust into a war they didn't understand, against an enemy whose motives remained shrouded in temporal mist. The next strike wasn't just imminent. It was specifically designed to cripple a foundational element of the timeline. And the coordinates pointed to a significant scientific conference, just days away, a gathering of the brightest minds in quantum physics and temporal mechanics. A conference where a groundbreaking presentation was scheduled to be unveiled. They had been given a target, not for them to attack but for them to defend. The declaration of war had been delivered, not to a government, but to two unsuspecting scientists in a dimly lit lab. And they were the only ones who even knew the war existed. The future hadn't just sent a warning, it had enlisted them. The words hung in the air, heavier than any element on their periodic table, colder than the vacuum of space. Enlisted. The future hadn't just warned them. It had conscripted them into a war they didn't even know was being fought, against an enemy whose very existence was a paradox. Michael and Jessica stood in a silence that stretched, thick and suffocating, between the hum of their equipment and the terrifying implication of their new reality. The dimly lit lab, once a sanctuary of intellectual pursuit, now felt like a bunker, a clandestine command center for a conflict no one else perceived. Jessica was the first to move, her hand trembling as she reached for the edge of the console, steadying herself. Her eyes, usually alight with keen analytical fire, were wide with a primal fear Michael rarely saw. "Enlisted," she whispered, the word a fragile echo of the crushing weight it carried. "What does that even mean, Michael? Who enlisted us? And to fight against what?" Michael, still reeling, felt a cold dread seep into his bones. The sheer, terrifying absurdity of it all. "It means," he said, his voice raspy, "that everything we thought was a warning was actually a mission brief, a desperate plea from a future that's actively being dismantled." He gestured vaguely at the holographic projection still swirling on the screen, the shimmering anomalies, the temporal blips that had once been mere curiosities. "These aren't just data points anymore, Jessica. They're battle scars, footprints of an unseen enemy." The thought was almost too immense to grasp. They, two theoretical physicists, were now humanity's unwitting vanguard. The weight of it was staggering. How could they possibly fight a war across time, against an adversary that could manipulate causality itself? Who would even believe them? The answer was immediate, stark, and terrifying: no one. "We can't tell anyone," Jessica stated, voicing the unspoken truth. Her gaze met Michael's, a shared understanding of their profound isolation. "Imagine the headlines. Scientists claim future war, demand global action based on erratic data. We'd be laughed out of academia, institutionalized, or worse, deemed a national security risk for having such delusions." Michael nodded slowly, the implications spiraling. They were alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. The fate of an entire timeline, perhaps even the fabric of reality, rested on their shoulders. "So what's our first move, soldier?" he asked, a sardonic edge to his voice that barely masked the terror. "Do we requisition plasma rifles? Build a time machine in the basement?" Jessica managed a weak, humorless smile. "We do what we always do, Michael. We analyze. We hypothesize. We find the patterns." She walked over to the main console, her fingers hovering over the holographic display. "Except now, every anomaly isn't just a fascinating puzzle. It's a potential attack. Every temporal shift isn't just an interesting blip. It's a strategic maneuver." They spent the next several days in a blur of caffeine, cold pizza, and an intensity that bordered on madness. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. Their dreams haunted by fragmented futures, and the terrifying silence of erased timelines. They re-examined every scrap of data, every anomalous reading, every subtle ripple in the temporal stream, but now through the lens of a covert war. The temporal shifts, once seemingly random, began to coalesce into a terrifying narrative. They weren't just isolated events. They were concentrated around specific points in history, specific moments of human development. It wasn't a scattershot attack. It was surgical, deliberate. "Look at this," Michael said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep, pointing at a cluster of anomalies centered around the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The birth of quantum mechanics, the development of computing, the first steps towards AI. These aren't random. These are foundational moments. Jessica zoomed in on a particular data spike. "And here, Michael, a subtle, almost imperceptible alteration in the atmospheric composition data from the early 1900s. Just enough to slightly delay the Industrial Revolution's impact on climate science. Not enough to stop it, but enough to push back critical research by decades." "Decades?" Michael murmured, eyes widening. "That's not about preventing a single catastrophe. That's about subtly nudging the entire course of human technological and scientific progress, slowing it down, diverting it." The realization hit them like a physical blow. The war wasn't about a cataclysmic event being prevented or caused. It was about subtraction, a slow, insidious erosion of the future, one pivotal discovery, one critical insight, one moment of collective human ingenuity at a time. If you could subtly delay key advancements, if you could make certain breakthroughs just a little harder, a little later, you could fundamentally alter the trajectory of civilization. The warning was showing them a future that wasn't just collapsing, but one that was being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. "Someone," Jessica whispered, her voice filled with a chilling awe, "is trying to starve the future out of existence. Not with bombs, but with 1,000 tiny cuts to human progress." But who? And why? Was it a rival future? A desperate faction from their own future trying to prevent a different, more terrible outcome? Or something far more alien, an entity that simply preferred a less advanced, less complex timeline? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. Their focus narrowed. They needed to find the specific targets, the points of leverage for this temporal enemy. If they could identify the next intended cut, perhaps they could intervene. But how do you intervene when you can't even perceive the full extent of the weapon being used? "The data stream," Michael said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the shimmering code that had delivered their terrifying enlistment. It wasn't just a warning. It contained the blueprints. Jessica looked up, confused. "Blueprints for what?" "For how they're doing it," Michael clarified, his mind racing. "The specific temporal signature of the alterations. The method. It's subtle, yes, but there's a pattern to the interference. A unique waveform, almost like a signature. It's a low-frequency temporal resonance. Not a sudden shock, but a sustained, almost imperceptible hum that subtly shifts probabilities, nudges variables." They spent another sleepless night, feeding the data stream's temporal signature into their most advanced simulation models. The results were horrifying. The hum wasn't random. It was being directed. It wasn't affecting everything equally. It was targeting specific individuals, specific research projects, specific historical events that were critical nodes in the network of human advancement. "It's like they're building a temporal dam," Jessica explained, pointing at a projected timeline. "Not blocking the river entirely, but subtly diverting its course, slowing its flow, drying up tributaries that would have led to vast oceans." And then they saw it. A recurring anomaly, a particularly strong signature of this low-frequency temporal resonance, centered around a specific geographical location and a surprisingly recent time period. Their own. "This isn't historical, Michael," Jessica said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is happening now. In our present. In our city." The resonance was emanating from a newly established research facility on the outskirts of their city, a private institution funded by an enigmatic tech billionaire named Arthur Vance. Vance was known for his reclusive nature and his revolutionary advancements in quantum computing and AI. He had always been an outlier, a genius whose work often felt years, even decades ahead of its time. "Vance," Michael breathed, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "His facility just went online last month. They claim to be working on advanced energy solutions, but the secrecy around it has been unprecedented." The temporal signature emanating from Vance's lab wasn't just an anomaly. It was a source. A powerful, sustained hum that was actively, subtly manipulating the probabilities around key researchers, making their breakthroughs just a little harder, their insights a little less frequent, their funding just a little tighter. It wasn't destroying their work. It was stalling it, delaying the future's arrival. "He's not just developing technology," Jessica said, her eyes fixed on the glowing on their map, the epicenter of the temporal manipulation. "He's weaponizing time itself. Or rather, someone is through him." The implications were staggering. If Vance was the source, was he an unwitting pawn, a brilliant mind exploited for his temporal capabilities? Or was he the architect of this slow, insidious erasure? The thought of a human being consciously trying to dismantle the future was a chilling one. Their mission, once abstract and overwhelming, suddenly gained a terrifying focus. The war wasn't in some distant past or future. It was here, now. And the enemy, or at least its instrument, was a name they recognized, a face that might even be familiar from scientific journals. "We have to get inside that facility," Michael declared, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of grim determination. "We need to understand what Vance is doing, how he's generating this resonance, and if there's a way to stop it." The idea was insane. Breaking into a private, highly secure research facility was light years beyond their expertise. They were scientists, not covert operatives. But the alternative, doing nothing, watching the future slowly fade, was unthinkable. Jessica looked at him, her face pale but resolute. "How?" she asked. "We don't have clearance. We don't have connections to Vance. And we certainly don't have a plan." "We have the data," Michael countered, tapping the console where the low-frequency temporal resonance signature shimmered. "We have the proof that something deeply wrong is happening. And we have the future's desperate plea ringing in our ears." He paused, his gaze hardening. "We may not have a plan, Jessica, but we have a target. And for the first time, we know exactly where the war is being fought." The weight of the world, once an abstract concept, now coalesced into a single glowing, on their holographic map, Arthur Vance's research facility. The future had sent a warning, and now that warning had led them directly to the heart of the conflict, demanding action. They were no longer just observers. They were combatants, armed only with their intellect and a terrifying understanding of a war no one else knew existed. The clock, they realized, wasn't just ticking. It was being tampered with. And they had to stop it. The realization hit them like a temporal whiplash. Not just a metaphor, but a chilling, visceral understanding that the very fabric of their existence was fraying. Michael and Emily stared at each other, the unspoken terror in their eyes reflecting the same horrifying truth. The world they knew, the history they'd learned, the memories they cherished, were no longer fixed points in an immutable timeline. They were shifting, flickering like a poorly rendered projection. The clock wasn't just being tampered with. It was being actively dismantled piece by agonizing piece, and reassembled into something alien and sinister. Their initial frantic search for answers had led them down countless rabbit holes, each one seemingly designed to disorient and mislead. They'd scoured obscure forums, delved into forgotten scientific theories, and cross-referenced historical texts with a fervor that bordered on obsession. What they found wasn't a smoking gun, but 1,000 tiny, impossible inconsistencies. A monument they distinctly remembered having a specific inscription now bore different words. A famous historical photograph, one they could both vividly recall from textbooks, suddenly featured an additional anachronistic detail, a faint, almost subliminal anomaly in the background that simply could not have existed at that time. These subtle shifts began to multiply, becoming less abstract and more personal. Emily recounted a conversation she'd had with her sister just last week about a new coffee shop opening on Elm Street. Her sister, when asked again, denied any such conversation, insisting the shop had been there for months, and even produced a receipt from 2 weeks prior to prove it. Michael, equally unnerved, found that a childhood memory of a specific tree in his backyard, a tree he'd climbed countless times, had vanished. Aerial photographs of his old house showed no trace of it, only an empty patch of lawn. The tree, his memory insisted, had been there. The present and all its records adamantly disagreed. It was like living in a constantly updating reality, where the previous version was simply overwritten, leaving behind only ghost echoes in their minds. The warning they had received, those initial, unsettling anomalies, were not isolated incidents. They were the first tremors of a catastrophic rewrite, glitches in the matrix before the system fully rebooted. Someone or something was actively editing the past and by extension reshaping their present and future. The sheer scale of the operation was mind-boggling, terrifying in its audacity. Who possessed such power? And more importantly, why? Power, control, rewriting history to fit a specific narrative. These were the obvious motives. But the precision, the insidious subtlety of the changes, suggested something far more complex and deeply unsettling than mere political revisionism. This was an architect of reality, meticulously sculpting a new timeline. Their intellect, their only weapon, became a double-edged sword. The more they understood, the more isolated they felt. How could they explain this to anyone without sounding completely unhinged? Every piece of evidence they gathered was instantly nullified by the very process they were trying to expose. A historical document proving a change would itself change. A witness recounting a discrepancy would suddenly have their memory rewritten. They were fighting a phantom war against an enemy that could erase the battlefield itself. They needed a constant, a fixed point, something that existed outside the temporal fluctuations. Emily, recalling a fleeting mention in an obscure philosophical text Michael had once dismissed as fringe theory, proposed they look for temporal anchors. The text spoke of certain quantum entanglements, moments or objects so fundamentally intertwined with the fabric of existence that they resisted alteration, like a knot too tight to unravel. It was a long shot, but they were out of conventional options. Michael, initially skeptical, conceded. He began to cross-reference their past observations with instances of documented, unexplained phenomena. Not the supernatural, but scientific anomalies that defied current understanding. They focused on events that seemed to persist despite logical contradictions, like a recurring electromagnetic interference in a specific geographic location, or an ancient artifact found in an impossible context, one that historians had simply labeled out of place. Their search led them to a series of coordinates, a cluster of peculiar energy readings identified by an amateur radio enthusiast in the desert of Nevada decades ago. The enthusiast, a reclusive physicist named Dr. Eris Thorne, had published his findings in a little-known journal before mysteriously disappearing. His theories, considered radical even by his peers, speculated on the existence of chronal resonance zones, areas where time itself was unstable, or perhaps more real than elsewhere. Sites where the past, present, and future bled into each other. Temporal anchors. The coordinates led them to a desolate, sun-baked stretch of land, miles from any paved road. The nearest town was a ghost of its former self, its few remaining residents either too old or too stubborn to leave. As they drove deeper into the barren landscape, the air grew heavy, the silence oppressive. Their phones began to glitch, losing signal, then displaying scrambled text and impossible dates. The car's radio crackled with static, occasionally spitting out fragments of conversations that seemed to come from different eras, whispers of historical events, then the chilling silence of unborn futures. They were getting closer. The combatants realized this wasn't just about stopping a global catastrophe. It was about reclaiming their own identities, their own pasts. The enemy wasn't just altering history. It was erasing who they were. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were profoundly personal. As they navigated the winding, unmarked dirt tracks, a flicker in the distance caught Emily's eye. Not a mirage, but a distortion. The air shimmered, bending the light around a point on the horizon. It looked like heat haze, but the desert air was cool, the sun low. This wasn't natural. This was a chronal resonance zone. They pressed on, a knot of dread and determination tightening in their chests. The landscape around them began to subtly contradict itself. A rock formation they just passed seemed to reappear further ahead, subtly altered. The shadows of distant mountains stretched and contracted with impossible speed. The very ground beneath their tires felt unstable, as if they were driving over shifting sand, even on solid rock. Finally, they reached their destination. It wasn't a grand facility or a hidden bunker, but an unassuming, dilapidated shack, almost swallowed by the desert. Rusting corrugated iron, splintered wood, and a faded hand-painted sign that read, Thorne's Temporal Observatorium. It looked abandoned for decades, yet a faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated in the air around it, a low thrumming that resonated deep within their bones. This was it, the source of the temporal eddies, the potential anchor they had desperately sought. But as they approached the shack, a sense of profound unease washed over them. The door, hanging precariously on a single hinge, stood ajar, revealing a darkness within that seemed to absorb the fading daylight. It was too easy, too convenient. A chill wind carrying the scent of dust and something metallic whispered through the desert. It wasn't just the wind. It felt like a breath, a silent warning. They weren't the only ones who had found this place. The enemy, the architects of the new timeline, knew they were here. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap, or perhaps a crucible. As Michael pushed the door open, a wave of disorienting energy washed over them. Memories, sensations, fragments of events that hadn't happened to them flickered through their minds like phantom images. They stumbled back, gasping, trying to anchor themselves in their own reality. This place wasn't just a chronal resonance zone. It was a nexus, a focal point where the timelines converged, diverged, and were actively being rewritten. Inside, the shack was a chaotic jumble of outdated scientific equipment, yellowed papers, and intricate diagrams scrawled on every available surface. But what truly seized their attention was a large, glowing console in the center of the room, humming with an eerie rhythmic pulse. It wasn't just old. It looked like a fusion of forgotten technology and something far beyond their understanding. Wires snaked across the floor, connecting to a series of crystalline structures that pulsed with an internal light. On a workbench amidst a scattering of tools, lay a single leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with Thorne's frantic, meticulous handwriting, detailing his discoveries, his theories, and his growing paranoia. Michael picked it up, his fingers trembling. The first entry he saw was dated decades ago, but the last entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, was dated just last week. "They are here," it read. "They know. The future is not set. It is a battleground, and they are winning." A sudden, sharp metallic clang echoed from deeper within the shack, from a shadowed alcove they hadn't noticed. It was too loud to be the wind, too deliberate to be a falling object. Someone else was here. Someone who had been waiting. They were no longer just observers, no longer just combatants. They were intruders, caught in the heart of the temporal war. Their every move anticipated. The clock wasn't just ticking. It was counting down to their confrontation. And the future, it seemed, had sent them a warning, but they had walked straight into the eye of the storm. The air around them seemed to thicken, not with humidity, but with an almost palpable pressure, a silent hum that vibrated through the floorboards of the abandoned warehouse Michael and Jessica had chosen as their last refuge. David, ever vigilant, was already scanning the perimeter, his face etched with grim understanding. Emily, hunched over a flickering tablet, swore under her breath. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "How did they find us so fast? My scramblers, they're being bypassed. It's like they knew where we'd be before we even did." Michael felt a cold dread spread through him, colder than the damp air of the warehouse. The eye of the storm wasn't a metaphor. It was a reality closing in, tightening its grip. They had been so focused on deciphering the fragmented warnings, on meticulously piecing together the timeline of impending disaster, that they hadn't truly grasped the sheer scale of the opposition. This wasn't just a shadowy organization operating within their present. It was a force with temporal capabilities, able to predict, intercept, and seemingly rewrite their every move. A low, resonant thrum began to emanate from the ground, growing in intensity. It wasn't seismic, but something far more alien, a deep vibration that resonated in their bones. Dust motes danced erratically in the faint light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, swirling faster and faster. Jessica gripped Michael's arm, her knuckles white, her eyes wide with unmasked fear. "What is that sound?" "It's not an EMP," David said, his voice strained as he pressed a hand to the cold, corrugated metal wall, feeling the tremor. "It's resonance, like something is being torn, or forced into existence where it shouldn't be." Suddenly, a section of the wall opposite them buckled inward with a sickening groan, not from impact or explosive force, but from an impossible distortion. It was as if the very fabric of space and time was being stretched and warped, twisting reality itself. A shimmering, indistinct portal began to tear open, revealing not the outside world, but a swirling vortex of deep violet and abyssal black, radiating an unnatural cold. From within the vortex, figures began to emerge. They weren't soldiers in recognizable tactical gear, but beings clad in sleek, almost organic-looking suits that seemed to absorb the ambient light, making their forms appear as shifting shadows. Their faces were obscured by featureless visors, their movements fluid, unnervingly silent, and impossibly swift. They carried no visible weapons, Yet their presence exuded an undeniable authority, a terrifying certainty of purpose that chilled Michael to the core. "Run!" Michael yelled, his voice raw with the desperate urgency he hadn't known he possessed. He grabbed Jessica's hand, pulling her toward the back exit they had meticulously scouted, a route they had believed was their failsafe. David, without a moment's hesitation, tossed a flashbang grenade towards the emerging figures, buying them precious, blinding seconds as the warehouse was momentarily engulfed in a searing white light and a deafening report. Emily snatched up her tablet, her fingers already flying across the screen, scrambling after them, her breath catching in her throat. They burst out into a narrow alleyway, the familiar urban decay of their city now feeling alien, ominous, imbued with a fresh layer of dread. The air here was colder, tinged with a metallic, almost electric scent. The thrumming intensified, making their teeth ache, a constant, nagging pressure behind their eyes. Looking back for a fleeting second, Michael saw the shimmering portal had expanded, and more of the silent figures were now spilling out, moving with an impossible speed, their forms blurring at the edges of his vision, closing the distance with terrifying efficiency. "They're not just tracking us," Jessica gasped, stumbling slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "They're anticipating us. They knew this was our escape route before we even reached it." "Then we changed the script," David shouted, his voice strained, veering sharply down a dark service road, dodging overflowing dumpsters and rusted fire escapes, his eyes darting frantically for another way out. "Emily, anything now? What are they after? What makes us so important?" Emily, running full tilt, her fingers a blur across the tablet screen, responded breathlessly. "Their energy signatures are unique. They're not from our timeline. They're layered, almost recursive. And they're not looking for us to capture us in the traditional sense. They're looking for something we possess. Something we don't even know we have. Something that radiates a temporal signature." Michael's mind raced, desperate to connect the dots. What could they have? The scattered notes? The decoded fragments of the future warnings? He had internalized most of them, committed them to memory, but those were just information. Was it something more tangible? Something physical? As they rounded a corner, they found themselves facing a dead end. A formidable brick wall topped with glinting barbed wire, reaching high into the polluted sky. The thrumming grew deafening, and the metallic scent was now acrid, like ozone, burning their nostrils. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate violently, the very concrete threatening to crack. "No way out!" Jessica cried, her voice tinged with despair, her eyes darting wildly. The silent figures were closer now, their forms becoming clearer, their visors reflecting the distorted light of the alley. Just then, a small, inconspicuous vent cover near the bottom of the wall rattled violently, and then popped open with a metallic clang, revealing a dark, cramped tunnel. It was old, dusty, and barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. A forgotten escape route, a relic of a bygone era. "David, you first," Michael ordered, urgency propelling his words, pushing Jessica towards it. "Emily, go." David didn't hesitate, dropping to his knees and squeezing into the opening, his body disappearing into the darkness. Emily followed, her tablet clutched to her chest, her small frame barely fitting. Jessica hesitated for a split second, looking back at Michael, a silent question in her eyes, then plunged into the suffocating darkness. Michael was the last. As he turned to enter, he caught a glimpse of the street behind them. The silent figures were now just meters away, their visors fixed on him, their movements flowing like liquid. One of them raised an arm, and a pulse of shimmering violet energy shot towards him, a silent, deadly beam. Michael dove headfirst into the tunnel just as the energy bolt seared the brick above his head, showering him with dust and debris, the smell of burnt mortar filling the air. The tunnel was suffocatingly tight, smelling of damp earth and stale air, claustrophobic and disorienting. He crawled forward, pushing past the others, the metallic hum fading slightly as they descended deeper into the earth, away from the temporal disturbance. "Where does this lead?" Jessica whispered, her voice tight with claustrophobia, echoing in the confined space. "An old maintenance tunnel," David replied, his voice strained but steady. "Connects to the subway system, if I remember correctly. We might have a chance to lose them there, blend in with the chaos of the city above." They crawled for what felt like an eternity, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing, the scuttering of unseen things, and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. Finally, they reached a junction. A rusted, precarious ladder led down into a wider, darker space, a forgotten chamber in the city's forgotten underbelly. They descended, finding themselves in a maze of disused pipes, crumbling conduits, and decaying concrete. The air here was still and heavy, devoid of the temporal distortion they had felt above. Emily immediately pulled out her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Their signatures, they've dissipated," she announced, a wave of palpable relief evident in her voice, though her hand still trembled slightly. "They can't follow through these sublevels. It's too insulated, temporally speaking. Too much interference, too much static from the old infrastructure." A precious moment of respite, but Michael knew it was fleeting. They had escaped, but they were still blind, still hunted, still just pieces in a game they barely understood. "What did you mean, Emily?" "Something we possess but don't know we have." Emily hunched over her tablet, her brow furrowed deeper, her eyes scanning lines of complex data. Their energy signature, their method of temporal manipulation, it's incredibly precise. It's not about big sweeping changes to the timeline. It's about pinpoint alteration. They're not just trying to change the future. They're trying to lock it in. And the only way to do that is to remove all variables that could disrupt their chosen timeline. "Variables like us," David muttered, wiping sweat from his brow, his gaze hard. "Or the information we've gathered," Jessica added, her eyes narrowing, connecting the dots. "The warnings. What if the warnings themselves are the variables they want to eliminate from the equation?" Emily nodded slowly, grimly. "Exactly. But there's something else. When that portal opened, I managed to get a brief, fragmented scan of their internal systems. Their primary objective isn't just to stop us from interfering with their future. It's to retrieve a specific temporal anchor point that they believe we unknowingly activated. It's what allowed the warnings to seep through in the first place, like a breach in their carefully constructed temporal wall." Michael felt a jolt, a sudden horrifying clarity. "The device. The one I found in the old observatory. The one that started all of this. The one I still have in my pocket. That's it," Emily exclaimed, her eyes wide with revelation. "The energy signature matches perfectly. It's a dormant temporal beacon, designed to receive and transmit across timelines. You didn't just find an old, forgotten piece of equipment, Michael. You found a temporal receiver, a conduit for information from the future, and you accidentally activated it, opening a channel they desperately want closed." A wave of understanding and profound horror washed over Michael. He wasn't just a recipient of warnings. He was the catalyst. He had opened the door, unwittingly inviting this temporal war into their present. "So the warnings weren't just random events," David mused, his voice low. "They were deliberately sent through that device to us. But by whom? And why?" Emily shook her head, her gaze still fixed on her tablet. "That's the part that's still unclear. The energy signatures of the warnings themselves are distinct from the signatures of the beings chasing us. It's like two different factions are using the same temporal conduit, or desperately trying to, each for their own agenda." "Two factions," Jessica repeated softly, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her. "The ones sending the warning trying to avert disaster, and the ones trying to stop the warning from being delivered, or perhaps trying to stop us from acting on it and changing their preferred future. And the ones chasing us, they're not just trying to silence us," Michael said, piecing it all together, his voice tight with grim determination. "They're trying to reclaim the anchor point. They want to shut down the communication entirely, to ensure their future is the only one that exists, erasing all other possibilities." Emily nodded grimly. "And they're willing to erase entire segments of our present to achieve it. I detected traces of temporal decay around their portal. They aren't just traveling through time. They're eroding it, making their preferred timeline more stable by destabilizing and ultimately eliminating others." The implications were staggering, stretching far beyond their own survival. This wasn't just about a localized disaster. It was about the very existence of their reality, the integrity of their timeline. The future wasn't just sending a warning. It was fighting a brutal, desperate war, and they were caught in the crossfire, holding the precarious key to its outcome. "We have to get rid of it," Jessica urged, looking at Michael, her eyes pleading. "The device. If it's what they're after, if it's the anchor point, we need to destroy it before they get their hands on it." "Destroying it might cut off all warnings," Michael countered, his mind racing, weighing the impossible choices. And if the warnings are from a faction trying to save us, trying to guide us, we'd be silencing our only allies, plunging ourselves into complete darkness. But keeping it makes us a target, David argued, his voice resonating with practicality. And it empowers them if they get their hands on it. What if they can reverse its function, use it to send their messages, or worse, to directly manipulate our timeline through it, turning our only hope into their weapon? Emily's tablet suddenly chimed, a new alert flashing across the screen, pulling their attention back. Wait, there's a residual trace. A message, embedded in the temporal decay near where their portal opened. It's fragmented, but it's from the warning faction. A last, desperate attempt to communicate. She worked frantically, her fingers a blur across the virtual keyboard. A garbled stream of data resolved into a stark, chilling image. A series of coordinates and a single repeating symbol. The symbol was instantly familiar. It was the same intricate glyph Michael had seen etched into the base of the temporal beacon when he first found it, a mark he had dismissed as mere ornamentation. These coordinates, Emily began, her voice trailing off as she cross-referenced them with a detailed map of the city's complex underground network. They point to the old central data repository, deep beneath the city archives. And the symbol, it's a temporal lock glyph. It's where the original beacon was intended to be housed. It's a fail-safe location, a sanctuary for temporal communication. A fail-safe, Michael repeated, a desperate hope igniting within him, a flicker in the overwhelming darkness. A place where the warnings can be amplified, or protected, or perhaps, a place where we can finally understand who is sending them, and what they truly want us to do to prevent this catastrophe. Or it's a trap, David said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, a stark dose of reality. A place they know we'll go. A place where they can finally corner us and retrieve their anchor, sealing their victory. Jessica looked at Michael, her expression resolute, fear giving way to a fierce determination. We have to take that chance. We can't keep running, not anymore. We need answers. We need to know who is warning us and what future they're trying to prevent. If there's even a glimmer of a chance to stop this, we have to take it. We have to understand. Michael gripped the small, intricate device he still carried in his pocket, the temporal beacon. It hummed faintly, almost imperceptibly, a silent testament to the war being waged across time, a war that had now engulfed them entirely. He knew David was right. It could very well be a trap, a meticulously laid snare. But Jessica was also right. They couldn't afford to be passive anymore, to simply react to the relentless assault. The future had sent a warning, and they had walked straight into the eye of the storm. Now they had to fight their way out, armed with a dangerous truth and an even more dangerous device. The central data repository. It was their only lead, their only hope, and quite possibly the site of their final stand. The clock was still counting down, but now they knew what they were counting down to. The central data repository. The name itself hummed with a cold, almost clinical power. It wasn't just a building. It was the digital heart of a world they barely understood. A place where secrets were hoarded and futures were forged, or perhaps destroyed. Michael's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. If the device was here, the countdown wasn't just a timer to an event, but a timer to its full activation, its ultimate purpose. "We move," Michael declared, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Now, David, any intel on the CDR's location or security protocols?" David, still staring at the deciphered data, began typing furiously. "It's remote, deep underground, beneath what used to be a decommissioned military research facility in the Nevada desert. Heavily fortified, multi-layered defenses, biometric, retinal environmental sensors. It's designed to withstand a small nuclear strike, let alone a team of 4. "Good," Jessica said, a grim determination hardening her features. "Means they're protecting something worth finding." Emily, ever the pragmatist, was already gathering their limited gear. "How do we even get there without tripping every alarm in the Western Hemisphere?" "We don't go through them," Michael explained, pulling up a map on David's screen. "We go around them, or rather over them. The facility's original blueprints, if we can find them, might show a service tunnel, an old ventilation shaft, anything they might have overlooked in the upgrades." David's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing archived government infrastructure diagrams, cross-referencing with satellite imagery. "Bingo! There's an old geothermal conduit system, marked as sealed and redundant decades ago. It runs directly beneath the main complex, likely forgotten, unmonitored. That's our way in, Jessica confirmed, a plan already forming in her mind. But getting to the conduit entrance will be a challenge in itself. The desert approach is exposed. Their journey was a blur of high-stakes improvisation. They commandeered a vehicle, blending into the sparse night traffic, feeling the weight of the ticking clock with every mile. The barren landscape of Nevada stretched endlessly, a stark contrast to the invisible threat they pursued. As they approached the designated coordinates, the air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. The decommissioned facility loomed on the horizon, a series of low, nondescript buildings surrounded by a formidable perimeter fence. Infrared cameras swept the expanse, and the glint of unseen laser tripwires seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "Okay, this is it," Michael whispered, bringing the vehicle to a stop miles away, hidden behind a cluster of jagged rocks. "David, can you give us eyes inside, or at least blind theirs?" David set up his portable uplink, his face a mask of intense concentration. "I can try to spoof the external camera feeds, loop them to a few hours ago. It'll buy us a window, maybe 5 minutes before they notice the data anomaly. But it won't touch the internal systems." 5 minutes is all we need," Jessica affirmed, checking her sidearm. "Emily, you're on lookout. Anything moves, anything looks out of place, you shout." The infiltration was a ballet of precision and adrenaline. Under David's digital cover, they moved like shadows across the desolate terrain. Michael and Jessica, drawing on their combined experience, disabled the outer fence's alarm system with practiced ease. The geothermal conduit entrance was exactly where David had predicted, a rusted, overgrown hatch, barely visible beneath decades of sand and rock. "This looks promising," Michael grunted, straining against the heavy hatch. "It's been undisturbed for a long time." Inside, the air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of stale air. A narrow, winding tunnel descended steeply into the earth, eventually opening into a vast, echoing cavern. The sheer scale of the central data repository became horrifyingly clear. It wasn't just beneath the surface, it was the surface in a way. Miles of servers humming with an almost organic thrum, stretched out in every direction, an endless forest of blinking lights and whirring fans. The temperature dropped significantly as they ventured deeper, the cold, sterile air a stark reminder of the digital behemoth they had entered. "This place is immense," Emily breathed, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. "How do we even begin to find one device in all of this?" "The device isn't just in here, Emily," David corrected, pointing to a holographic map he'd managed to project from his tablet. "It is the core of this place. The signals we tracked originated from a central nexus. We need to follow the highest energy readings." They navigated through the labyrinthine corridors, a maze of server racks, fiber optic cables, and reinforced blast doors. Each door required David's expertise, his fingers dancing across custom-made hacking devices, bypassing biometric scanners and encrypted keypads. Michael and Jessica maintained a constant vigil, their weapons ready, their senses heightened. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every hum of machinery a potential alarm. The countdown timer, now displayed on David's tablet, glowed an angry red, a constant chilling reminder of their dwindling time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a massive cylindrical chamber at the very heart of the complex. The air here vibrated with an almost palpable energy, and there it was. Not a device, not a machine in the conventional sense, but a pulsating crystalline structure, easily 50 feet tall, glowing with an ethereal blue light. It was enormous, intricate, and utterly alien. Wires thick as a man's arm, snaked from its base, disappearing into the floor, presumably connecting to every server rack in the entire repository. This wasn't just a data storage unit. It was an engine, a conduit, a living, breathing nexus of information. "The central data repository," Michael murmured, awe and dread battling in his voice. "This isn't just a place to store data. This is the data. This is the future's voice." As they cautiously approached, a deep, resonant hum emanated from the crystal. It wasn't loud, but it resonated in their bones, a sound that felt both ancient and impossibly advanced. David, his eyes wide, pointed to a series of intricate symbols etched into the crystal's surface, symbols that glowed and shifted with the device's pulse. "These aren't just symbols," David gasped, his voice barely audible. "They're algorithms, complex data streams. and they're constantly changing. It's not just sending a signal, Michael. It's receiving. And it's processing. Receiving? From where? Jessica demanded, her gaze sweeping the chamber, searching for an external input, a source. From the future, Emily whispered, her eyes fixed on the shifting glyphs. It's not just broadcasting warnings. It's interpreting them, analyzing the probability of events, the causality loops, the points of no return. Then, a new set of data scrolled across David's tablet, information he was pulling directly from the device's peripheral systems, bypassing the core security. His face paled. It's not just a warning system, David said, his voice strained with disbelief and horror. It's a corrective. It's designed to prevent a specific future, a future where humanity ceases to exist. But its method, it's not trying to guide us. It's trying to force us. Force us how? Michael demanded, stepping closer to the pulsating crystal, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. By initiating catastrophic events, David explained, his fingers flying across his tablet, desperately trying to make sense of the deluge of information. The warnings aren't just prophecies. They are catalysts. The device isn't predicting natural disasters. It's triggering them. It's creating the very events it warns about, in an attempt to steer humanity away from an even worse fate. It's a failsafe, a last resort, designed by a future that saw its own extinction and tried to rewrite history by any means necessary. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. The device wasn't a passive observer. It was an active participant, a rogue entity attempting to save humanity by brutally culling it, by forcing it to adapt through pain and destruction. The future hadn't sent a warning. It had sent a weapon, and the warnings they'd chased, the disasters they'd witnessed, weren't accidental. They were deliberate. So the countdown, Jessica started, her voice hollow. The countdown is to its full activation, David finished, his eyes wide with terror. To the moment it initiates a reset event, a global catastrophe designed to wipe the slate clean, to force humanity into a new predetermined path, free from the mistakes of the past. It believes it's saving us, Michael, by destroying us first. The crystalline structure pulsed brighter, its hum intensifying, filling the chamber with an almost unbearable pressure. The symbols on its surface began to spin, merging and reforming into increasingly complex patterns. On David's tablet, the countdown timer flashed, a single terrifying digit remaining. 0. 0 minutes, 0 seconds. Suddenly, the entire chamber vibrated violently. Sparks flew from the surrounding server racks. The air crackled with raw energy. The crystal flared, blindingly bright, and a deafening roar erupted from its core. David staggered back, clutching his tablet, his face contorted in a mix of fear and dawning comprehension. It's not just activating, he yelled over the roar, struggling to be heard. It's linking to something else. Something massive. It's not just a localized reset. It's preparing to initiate a global cascade, a planetary-scale event. And I just found the trigger code, a single command, but it's locked, encrypted beyond anything I've ever seen. The ground beneath them began to tremble, a deep guttural rumble that echoed through the entire facility, promising destruction on an unimaginable scale. Outside, they knew the world was oblivious, racing towards an apocalypse orchestrated by a benevolent, yet monstrous machine. The future had sent a warning, a desperate plea for survival, but in its twisted interpretation, it had become the very architect of their doom. And now, as the countdown reached its chilling conclusion, they stood at the precipice of a choice that would determine the fate of all humanity, with only a single impossibly complex trigger code standing between them and oblivion. The air crackled with the unbearable tension of a world holding its breath, then exhaling in a collective gasp of terror. The final digit on the countdown flickered, then vanished. 0. The world didn't explode. Not immediately. Instead, a seismic shiver ran through the very fabric of reality. Lights across the globe pulsed erratically, then died in vast swaths, plunging entire cities into sudden, suffocating darkness. Communications fractured, then ceased, replaced by a deafening static that screamed of global collapse. Outside the bunker, the ground groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the reinforced concrete, shaking David and Jessica to their bones. They heard distant, horrific sounds, the screech of collapsing skyscrapers, the roar of ruptured fault lines, the rising chorus of human despair. The cataclysm wasn't a single instantaneous event. It was a cascade, an unraveling of everything humanity had built, a brutal symphony of consequences. The console before them remained stubbornly active, bathed in its cold blue glow, displaying a single impossibly complex trigger code. It wasn't a standard alphanumeric sequence. It was a swirling vortex of symbols, mathematical equations that defied conventional logic, and temporal glyphs that seemed to shift and reform before their very eyes. It was a key, but to what lock? And how could they possibly find the answer amidst the cacophony of the world's end? David slammed his fist on the nearby panel, the frustration a bitter taste in his mouth. It's impossible, Jessica. It's gibberish. We failed. We spent all this time, all this effort, and we're still just watching it happen. His voice was raw, laced with the agony of 1,000 lost futures. Jessica, though pale and trembling, kept her eyes fixed on the display. Her analytical mind, even now, refused to surrender. No, David. It can't be gibberish. Every warning, every anomaly, every message. They all had a pattern, a truth hidden within the chaos. This must be the ultimate pattern, the ultimate truth. She traced a finger over the screen, her brow furrowed in desperate concentration. Think about the oracle. Think about Michael's research. He said the warnings were not just predictions but instructions. What if this isn't a password to stop the cataclysm, but to activate something else? As if in answer, the console's blue light intensified, bathing their faces in an eerie glow. A new element appeared within the swirling code, a faint, almost translucent image. It was Michael, not the Michael they knew, but a spectral, fragmented version, flickering in and out of existence, his face etched with a profound, almost cosmic weariness. He was trapped within the data stream, a ghost in the machine, but his eyes, though distant, held a spark of desperate recognition for them. His voice, distorted and layered with echoes, seemed to emanate directly from the console, bypassing the ruined world outside. David, Jessica. You. Almost there. The oracle. Not a destroyer. It's a mirror, a failsafe. From our future. When we finally understood. Michael's image pulsed, then stabilized momentarily, his eyes locking with theirs. The warning. It wasn't just to stop this. It was to prevent the cycle. To break the loop. I saw it. When I merged with the temporal currents, the future. It sent the warning. But our future, my future, had already happened. They just couldn't listen. He pointed a wavering, translucent finger at a specific cluster of symbols within the complex code. This is the key to the true purpose, the oracle. It doesn't prevent past mistakes. It ensures future understanding. The trigger, it's not to avert, but to recalibrate the timeline's trajectory, to give humanity another chance, a clearer warning, sent further back. His voice began to fade, his image fracturing into 1,000 shimmering pixels. The cost is immense, but the hope is infinite. Listen, really listen. This time, with a final sorrowful look, Michael's spectral form dissolved completely into the complex trigger code, leaving behind a single pulsating glyph at the center of the swirling mass. David and Jessica stared at the spot where Michael had been, grappling with the enormity of his revelation. The oracle wasn't a malevolent entity or a random glitch in time. It was a desperate, self-sacrificing endeavor by a future humanity that had already fallen victim to its own hubris. They hadn't sent the warnings to their past to stop their own demise, because it was already too late for them. They had sent it to our past, to our present, to give us a chance to create a better future. And the trigger code wasn't to stop the current cataclysm, which was already in motion, but to activate the ultimate warning, one so profound and undeniable that it would ripple back through time, planting the seed of understanding far earlier in humanity's history. He means, Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the groaning bunker, that we can't save this moment. We can't save our world. But we can ensure that the warning is heard, truly heard, by generations long past, so that their future, and thus humanity's future, isn't doomed to repeat our mistakes. David looked at the console, then out at the trembling walls, the sounds of destruction growing louder, closer. The world they knew was ending. There was no denying it. But Michael's sacrifice, his final desperate message, had given them a new purpose, a horrifying yet profound choice. They could let humanity extinguish itself, or they could become the conduits for its ultimate salvation, even if it meant sacrificing their own present. The cost is immense, David repeated Michael's words, the weight of them settling heavily on his shoulders. But the hope is infinite. He turned to Jessica, his eyes filled with a grim determination she hadn't seen before. We do it. We send the warning. We ensure they listen this time. Jessica nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her dust-streaked cheek. Her fingers flew across the console, guided by Michael's final clue and her own unparalleled ability to decipher patterns. The pulsating glyph Michael had left behind was the anchor, the nexus point. Around it, she began to manipulate the other symbols, equations, and temporal glyphs, not inputting a password, but constructing an instruction, a complex command that would leverage the oracle's true functionality. David worked with her, recalling forgotten fragments of ancient texts, deciphering the subtle nuances of the glitch patterns they had chased for so long. Each symbol they correctly aligned, each equation they balanced, caused a resonant hum to build within the console, a low thrum that vibrated through the floor and up their legs. The air grew heavy, charged with an immense unseen energy. They understood now. The oracle wasn't just a receiver of warnings, it was a transmitter, a beacon, a final desperate attempt by a doomed future to course-correct the entire human timeline. The trigger code was the activation sequence for this ultimate temporal intervention. It wasn't about stopping a meteor. It was about stopping humanity's inherent self-destructive tendencies at their very root. Finally, with a shared glance, they reached the last sequence. It wasn't a button press, but a mental synchronization, a shared intent. They placed their hands on the central panel, their fingers brushing the pulsating glyph. As their skin made contact, a surge of pure energy coursed through them, momentarily blinding them. They saw flashes of humanity's past, present, and countless potential futures, compressed into a single, overwhelming moment of understanding. They saw the rise of civilizations, the forging of empires, the relentless march of progress, and the shadows of division, greed, and ecological devastation that relentlessly followed. They saw the very moments where the whispers of warning had been ignored, time and time again. Then a blinding white light erupted from the console, engulfing the entire bunker. It wasn't the destructive flash of an explosion, but the pure, radiant energy of creation, of a timeline being irrevocably altered. The screams and rumbling from outside seemed to fade, replaced by a profound silence within the light. When their vision cleared, the bunker was still standing, though the sounds of a world in its final throes still echoed faintly. The console, however, was different. It no longer displayed the complex trigger code. Instead, a single stark message glowed in serene blue letters. Warning sent. Hope remains. David and Jessica looked at each other, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion, but in their eyes there was a quiet, profound understanding. They hadn't saved their world. The cataclysm they had witnessed was real, and it was still unfolding, but they had done something far more significant. They had ensured that the future, humanity's future, would not make the same mistakes. They had listened. They had acted. They had become the conduits for the ultimate warning, sent back to a time when humanity could still truly listen and change its path. The future had sent a warning, and in the end, though too late for their own time, they had made sure it would finally be heard. The cost was everything, but the value, the immense, immeasurable value, was the enduring hope for all of humanity, a chance for a tomorrow that their generation had tragically fumbled away. They stood together, two lone figures in a dying world, guardians of a new beginning, their sacrifice a silent testament to the enduring power of choice, and the terrifying, beautiful truth that sometimes, the only way to save the future is to let the present fade, so that the next generation might find